And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Wow. Hi, Thomas. Lovely to meet you finally.
You too.
Yeah.
Virtually.
I'm here in Sydney, and we've got Thomas is joining us from Brisbane, and we've got Susan on the Gold Coast. So Susan is handling all of the back end for tonight. So welcome, everyone. Wow, we have got, I think this is a record. I think this has probably been the biggest virtual event that we've run, and we are pretty much full on the Zoom, and we're also live on YouTube. So just a couple of housekeeping points. If you're with us on Zoom, there's a chat bar at the bottom. So feel free to pop any questions or comments, say hi, tell us where you're joining us from. And similarly, if you're on the live stream on YouTube, you can put comments. We'll be monitoring both of those. If you're with us on Zoom, there's also a Q&A. So you'll be able to ask any questions there. If you have any like really curly questions for Thomas, he loves curly questions, don't you, Thomas? You can pop those into the Q&A. Otherwise, in the chat, but we're probably more likely to see them in the Q&A. So welcome, Thomas. Thank you so much for agreeing to show us your fantastic dynamic scenario manager this evening. I was so excited when I saw it. For those of you who don't know the background, I was one of the judges on the Financial Modelling Innovation Awards, and that was announced just last month. So it was, what was it, about 3 or 4 weeks ago? That we announced the winners. So I was on the judging panel, and we had lots of amazing financial modelling innovations. It was quite an incredible event, and as a judge, we had to go through all of the innovations, which was incredible. And when I got to Thomas's, the dynamic scenario manager, I absolutely loved it because it was just so simple. In fact, that it uses standard Excel, I really loved. And yeah, it wasn't really until the day before the announcement when we were talking about who was actually going to announce and win it. And Thomas's the dynamic scenario manager actually won one of the categories, and they said, who wants to announce the winner? And I put my hand up because I loved his solution so much. And it wasn't until later that I realized that it was Thomas's entry. And Thomas and I have sort of been in contact before through the Brisbane Meetup group. So it seems like such a long time ago when we used to actually run face-to-face meetups. Do you remember those, Thomas?
Oh, very vaguely now. This seems to be the new world order, doesn't it?
We used to run face-to-face meetups, yeah, in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, and Thomas was involved with those. So we actually already knew each other. So of course I wasted absolutely no time in asking Thomas to show us, to take us through his fantastic tool. So Thomas works as a senior manager at BDO in Brisbane, and the dynamic scenario manager is something you've kind of developed as a sideline, is that right?
So how I came around to developing it is we do a lot of engagements that have scenario analysis as a part of it. Not an unusual thing in the financial modeling space, but what I was finding was causing problems was our models are often, they're very dynamic in the sense that we're having to make changes on them and have to get reports out based on those models very rapidly. What I didn't like about the traditional scenario modeling approach of VBA code or multiple models is just how long that took.
Yes.
And the moment I saw data tables, I thought, oh, here we go, this might be the solution. But it just, the way I'd seen other people do it just didn't quite seem efficient enough for what I wanted it to do. So I started investigating how far could we.
Yes, I mean, I love data tables.
I think they're actually incredible.
Yeah.
So it's great that they're included in Excel. Lots of power and functionality in there. But I just wanted to see how far we could get them.
Absolutely. And it's great to sort of push. And I mean, that's what the awards were all about, was taking what was required in a model and just pushing Excel that little bit further, because that's a real frustration with the data table, is that you only have 1 or 2 inputs and everything having to be on one page, the inputs and the outputs, and just having that limitation we're having to work with.
Mhm.
So we've actually or Thomas has very, very generously made the tool available for everyone. So if you received an email prior to this session, you would have gotten a link. I'll send out another copy of that tomorrow to those who registered. But are you going to maybe
I can
take us through it,
good.
Thomas?
I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
All right, so hopefully everyone can see that now. So this is the copy of the model that you should all have access to, or will shortly have access to. I've included just a little bit of an introduction about the overview, about the model, which we'll go through now. That kind of explains how I developed it and why. Probably the more interesting part on this page is the calculation diagram. I like to very much think of my models in terms of calculation flows to try and understand how the best way of doing it. So I thought this would be a useful tool to explain to people how this works. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite follow necessarily every financial modeling best practice in the sense that it does have calculations going left to right as well as right to left. So I thought this might just help a little bit to explain how it works.
It's one of the things I love is the structure and just it's a pleasure to look at as well.
Well, it's nice to hear as well. Before I dive into that a little bit more, I thought I might just quickly do a recap of data tables in case anyone is unaware of what they look like in a more out of the box way.
Yeah. Do you want me to, it would be kind of interesting to know who is actually using data tables. So if you're on Zoom, I've actually just popped up a quick poll. So it'd be interesting to know, how familiar people are with data tables already.
Very agree.
Yeah, seems a bit of a mix between people who use them all the time, use them every now and then, and some who perhaps are fairly new to data tables. That's interesting.
I think it's interesting you mentioned the category of people that use them every now and then. I seem to be people I've encountered either use them all the time or hadn't heard of them. I think it's one of those things where once you've seen the power of them, oh, there you go.
Yes.
Wrong.
Yeah, most people are kind of in the middle. Most people use them every now and then. Interesting. Thank you for that.
Definitely. All right. So I might just close that off my screen. So
you'll give us a quick overview
just
of
a very
what
quick,
a normal data table does.
Yeah, a very quick normal data table. So all I've done is a very simple calculation of how many items you sold, how much of them are portion A, how much of them are item A and how many are B. This is calculated. There's some input cells here. Now, the first style of data table is a one variable one, where what it does is it tests, well, what's the impact of that if this portion changes? So if we have our calculated values here, these are linked up to my calculations above. Then this data table is referencing C10 up here. And what you can see is at 60%, it perfectly aligns with our core set of calculations, but it actually moves dynamically along here based on what the different proportion is. So the great thing here is you can actually see what your different revenue items are depending on the portion. The next step of it then is you can actually make this a two variable data table. So what I've done here with this one is same percentages across the top, but I've actually said, well, what's the impact to my total revenue here if I change, what have I done? The item A cost or revenue per item down the side here. So what you get is you get a two-dimensional data table where 60% and $25 are in the middle, and then everything else kind of moves along there. Very simple example of how data tables are done. But the great thing is you are getting in this table, for example, 25 different results from one set of calculations. So if I change an assumption or a fundamental, I can change this, for example, well, what if we're talking about 12,000, 120,000, all that dynamically changes, which is really cool and helpful when you're building a model that you don't have to worry about VBA or anything like that, that Excel has the built-in smarts using the data table function. What got me interested in them though was looking at this going, well, how often do I do a scenario where there's only one or two variables I want to test? Usually I'm building complex infrastructure financing models that I need dozens, if not more variables being tested and up and down in different categories in different ways, that I started thinking, well, do I need a data cube? What do I need? Which then led me to the to a data table built into a scenario manager. So if I kind of go back to the calculation diagram just to explain a little bit how it flows, it'll make a little bit more sense hopefully then. What the scenario manager does is it sits here in between the general inputs and the calculations. It then also sits itself between the calculations and the outputs. So what you have is this kind of it sits in between everything. So you have all your inputs flowing into the calculations being selected, but then you also have the results all being calculated dynamically here, so that you can have two types of outputs, being either your selected scenario outputs or your, oh, there you go, typo. There we go, live demonstration. Never do live TV. That should be all all scenario outputs, where you can select different ones, which I'll show you again in a little while. Hopefully that diagram.
I'll fix that up in the download version. I didn't notice that either.
We can always edit. It's fine. There's also a little diagram here down the bottom. Sorry, a little index here to work your way through the model. But what I might do is I might jump straight into the scenario manager itself to kind of explain a little bit how this is structured. So what I've done is very similar to the one variable table. What I've done is, instead of using an actual variable to change here, I've actually set it up with scenario numbers being the key driver. So how this works is basically each column in this on this work page represents a unique scenario within the model that I want to test, with the active inputs being selected over here. So you'll see across here, I've set up my scenario 3, for example, is based on my reference project 1, but I want to do 10% revenue. What's that look like? I want to do -10. But then if I scroll over a little bit, which you can also look at things like worst case, best case options, as well as having different reference projects. Just to quickly explain what I mean by a reference project, one thing we do a lot of in our modeling is, it's not just a single set of calculations we want to do. We want to actually look at, we might have a few different primary project options that we're looking at. So it may be building a hospital in one stage, you may be building a hospital in 2 stages. Pretty fundamental different scenarios, likely with materially different inputs. But we still want to pass them through the same set of calculations. So I've set it up so that the first 2 options, that could be more depending on how you build it, could be multiple reference projects, have inputs in every cell as we go down. What I've done is been able to cheat then is have it for the what I call secondary scenarios. You can actually use the primary, you can say what reference project you want to use as your primary inputs. So for example, if I go into this formula just to explain a little bit more, this column here, active, is the actual inputs that go from the scenario manager into the calculations. So if you do a search dependence on this column, it'll all be flowing into this calculations page here, which for the purposes of this model is just a fairly generic set of P&L calculations. So don't spend too much time worrying about this page. Basically, this page could be replaced by any of your existing models. What this calculation does is it basically says, using the scenario numbers, this active number is the key one, which is driven from the outputs page, but is actually what the data table later, which I'll get to, is linked to. But what it says is whatever scenario is active, using lookups, pick up the right number and look in this cell. Now, what I've got in here, which I think is also quite interesting, is it actually a is blank formula at the beginning. So what it does is it basically says, if this cell is blank, so if I just quickly, this might make more sense. Let's change it. So if I go back to my scenario manager, it's now 4. So what it should be doing, my lookup is saying, well, what's in column 4? It could be a sum if, but I use lookups because I use text-based ones sometimes as well. What this is blank does at the first, it actually says, well, if it's blank, actually, I just want you to look at the reference projects. So what you can see here is it's returning 10%, but that's because, or 12% now, but that's because it knows, well, there's nothing in here. So I can put it, so I can pick up what's here. That avoids having to fill in every cell in here. So what this makes really cool, I think, is that if you want to know what's included in a scenario, it's just a matter of going through a specific scenario and picking up, well, what's not blank. So for example, in my best case, worst case, you can see instead of using my moderate profiles, I've said, well, what if my revenues are high? My revenue unit demand is high. What if my unit prices are high, but my salaries are low and my other expenses are low? That is very quick, but this one, for these ones where I'm just testing revenue as a plus 10% sensitivity down below, I don't want to change my demand profiles. So I just leave that blank and it automatically picks up whatever I've selected here. So it keeps your scenario manager very clean. And as you would have seen here, even though we're on scenario 4 at the moment as active inputs going to the calculation, I can change this to 12. I don't have to change it here because.
That's great. That's cool, because so often you have to copy everything multiple times. So it's quite nice.
Or link it like this. And I figured that
Excel.
And
it is messy.
You don't have to do that with Excel. Excel is smart enough that you can, there's a, I think a fairly simple formula here is look up. If it's blank, if it returns a blank, then just look up the reference project, the relevant reference project. But if it isn't blank, pick up the number in it. So this is blank, so it's returning medium from here. Might just quickly touch on the profiles. So you would see here under the weighted cost of capital, it's a single input. With our inputs, often we don't want to, we have linked inputs or what I call profiles. So you don't want to have to put in an entire like 30 years worth of growth assumptions in here when you know they're all moving in a similar way. So I've actually come up with a second type of input, which I call growth profiles. Other people may have other names for them, but they're fairly straightforward in the sense of they're just different assumption paths. So in this case, up to 10-year model, my revenue demand, I've got a medium case of 0.5%, 1.5% per year, but I've got a high case where it's 2% for the first 4 years, and a low case where it's nothing in the first year, 5%, 1%, what these are. But how this works here is just using basic sum ifs to pull through. This here drives what my actual growth rate is here. So you'll see here my active value is medium. So it knows to go and look at the medium case on this page based on whatever is selected here. So it's a way of bringing through a set of combined assumptions together. Another way you could do that could be if you're looking at a few different cost plans for a capital works project. It could be, well, I want to use the first set of cost plans or cost plans 2, and it could be selected here. So you don't have to enter every cost plan every time for every scenario or everyone on this page. You could just say, what set of scenario inputs do I want to use?
David Thompson calls it data input by exception. I think that's a good way.
Oh, well, I like that. I very much like that. Yeah, I'm very much about trying to make it by that exception. I think is a good way of thinking about it. That just makes it a lot cleaner and easier to read. Yeah. Particularly if you like had this as a sea of mediums, it'd be really hard to see sometimes where it had changed. I've done it other ways with conditional formatting to try and have it pop, but I felt this was
I tend to do that. Yeah, but that's good. Just a couple of questions. Okay, JP said it's nice and clean, which I definitely agree with. Rajiv says, I'm assuming weighted cost of capital is WACC, which is not just pure equity. Have you modeled the percentage sources of capital?
And in this case, but in most models, you certainly would. This is very much just designed to be a very simple.
Yeah, we're really just looking at the scenario rather than worrying too much.
It's a discount rate
today.
But the great thing about this is if I wanted to change that, all I'd have to do is add in a few extra lines here, have my calculation. So my what's my debt to equity ratio, what's my cost of debt, what's my cost of equity, have that calculated here, flow through the model. I wouldn't have to touch anything, and all my scenario analysis on the outputs would automatically be updated. So a good example of how sometimes when you're building a model and you might want to add in extra scenarios, because someone may say, well, what if my cost of debt goes up? What if it goes down? What is the importance of it? Where at the moment, yeah, certainly I only have a whack, but I want to be able to test that in more detail. It's very it's literally just adding lines like this, going in, copying the formulas across, having this become a calculated value.
Cool.
As a very simple calculation. So, which I think is pretty cool in that.
We've got a couple of comments and questions both on YouTube and on Zoom about performance, because data table can often slow things down. So having all of these multiple variables and
so the great thing I found with this is, so this is
does it slow things down? Have you had troubles with that?
It can slow things down a little bit, which is probably a very understandable limitation of this process. That being said, so this is the data table down the bottom, which I'll come back to, with annual portions. This is 69 rows. I've had a couple hundred with, I think, 50 or 60 scenario columns across it. Performance has not been, it's not quite instantaneous, but it's not exactly slow either. Certainly faster than VBA running through and doing a copy paste in the background, I found. So it is something you need to consider, and being very judicious on what outputs you include down here that you want to be able to test. That you're not testing every line item in your calculations, but so there's ways around it in a sense. But I've certainly found that performance has been, I think, acceptable with very large models. This one, yeah, if I run the calculation speeds, it's not too much slower.
Yeah, so not too much slower than if you just had an ordinary data table. So if you had like a big complex model and you put this over the top of it, it's a little, I would imagine it's a little slower.
Yeah, it's a little bit slower, which is fair enough.
Yeah.
Sorry, which is not unexpected, given the power of data tables, I'd say. But it is something to consider when trying to implement this. Great.
We've got a question. Have you got time, Thomas, to show us how to actually create the data table in the first place?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah? Okay.
So what I'm going to do is I'll just delete it. So one thing, so a little bit of behind the scenes. So I actually have
that's dramatic.
I have some automatic conditional formatting behind it. So one of the things, due to the performance issues that sometimes happen, I find it better to actually have the data table disabled when you're building your model, just to make sure that it's calculating as fast as possible while you're doing it. So I often have it deleted. It's not until I'm actually running the results that I add it back in. So what I do then is, so I've set up these numbers. They're all based on the scenario numbers on the top. Down the side here, I have some labels here just for my own benefit that I know I'm pulling through the right scenarios. These down here are the actual outputs from my calculations. These could be anything in your calculations. They could be a single point of data. They could be a full series like I have here. But the basic limitation of this approach is that each row represents a single data point. So for example, here I've got units of revenue, unit of sales revenue by years down the side. So I just use a simple sum ifs to pull through the annual data. And then the same down the page. Because I like having it being a little bit clean, I've added some formatting here just to highlight where it changes. But you get a big NPV down the bottom, for example, coming out of my calculation. So each one of these are linked directly using the active scenario calculations here. So I might just flick back to option 1. And so that all changed. That's now all based on. So to actually create the data table, I select the whole area. So that is, if I just go back, this blank holder cell in F68, and then the numbers all the way down. And if I go to data, what if analysis, data table. Now, because I'm changing rows, oh, now I've got to remember, is it F's? I'll do, oh, cheat. Hopefully, I just select that number because that's what I want to test. I want this number to change so that it picks up a different ones of these. Hit enter, hit enter. No, with any luck, that has worked. So what we can see now is my revenue sales. Those two match, but that's because I have option 1 selected. But you'll see that we get lots of different revenue numbers depending on what's active in any time. So my two reference projects actually have very different revenue assumptions. So you can see there that one goes from 1.185 million to 4.6, all the same calculations. Haven't have to have multiple sets of calculations. It's all running through here. Yeah, through my simplified profit and loss, but able to pull out that different ones there pretty easily. So the other good thing about deleting that like that. So one thing you can't do with data tables is you can't change them, or it's not easy to change a part of a data table. Excel doesn't like it. Fine, that's fair enough. But what you can do actually is here. So delete it. So if I extended my model into a 20-year model over here by adding 20 more columns, move the calculations across, great, happy days. Here, all I'd have to do is add 10 rows to every section and then recreate the data table. And I wouldn't have to worry about changing my VBA code to make sure I've picked up any new assumptions. Wouldn't have to worry about new outputs coming through. It's all there.
Yeah, it's got that sort of array limitation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When you have to,
I find very much like Excel that the limitation
before you apply the data table.
That's right. Yeah. So
just a couple of comments. So people were saying just about turning the calculation off. Of course, that can improve the calculation speed if people are having some trouble with that. David Thompson asked if you'd considered using dynamic arrays for the scenario numbers and the periods, so that would improve speed.
Hasn't been something I've looked into yet, but it's certainly,
yeah, it's all quite new, the dynamic array. Yeah. Cool. Kim wants to know how to review the data table results, but I think you're getting to that on the output. The order of the scenarios can be any order you want. Yes, I think so. And using data table will allow new scenarios to be added easily, especially if named ranges are used. I don't know if named ranges are going to make that much difference, but you can certainly add extra
certainly very easy to add. So I usually leave a bunch of blank scenarios at the end for where I want to start testing. So I have my best case, worst case, but it could simply be, well, oh, hang on, maybe I want to test my whack. So as a very quick and dirty my whack, and if I go down to my NPV, sure enough, it's moved. So very quick and easy to add extra scenarios. If you run out of columns, also equally easy, delete the data table, add the extra columns, recreate the data table. So again, for the performance issue, due to the performance issues, you don't necessarily want to leave a heap of blank scenarios around, but I've got 5 here and that's fine. It might be worth jumping to the outputs to kind of show how this actually all then kind of gets tied together from a human point of view, as opposed to this data table, which it looks.
Yeah, that's really just the back end, the calculations, isn't it?
Yeah. So the outputs page, how I generally, as I mentioned in the overview with the typo, there's 2 types. There's the selected scenario and the all scenario. I'm going to change it myself here, just so I keep all scenario outputs. In the selected scenario one, these are connected directly into the calculations page like you would normally do. But because all the inputs are driven through the scenario manager, you can actually change. I've got an option, this drop down, which I was playing with before, that changes the scenario number. This is just a very simple sum if in this key number that just changes what's being fed through the primary calculations. So a really quick way of someone saying, well, what if, so if I go back to option 1, this is what it looks like. Well, what does it look like if revenues are 10% up? As we saw, nothing changes down in the salaries and other expenses line. We wouldn't expect it to, but my revenue goes up and gross margin changes. So a very quick way of, you could print this, you could have a VBA macro that could change that for you and come up with those different results. So that's fairly standard scenario change in technology.
You haven't used any VBA in this at all, have you?
There's no VBA in this. There probably is some legacy VBA code sitting in the file if you wanted to dig through, dig into.
There's just a question from Renia saying, what's the purpose of testing username windows in your VBA code? But I don't quite follow because I didn't think there was any in there.
No testing or anything in there. This is just a simple drop down thing. Where is it? What am I even looking for anymore? Yeah, that's just a very basic drop down menu there. But what I think is where this really starts to show is this sensitivity table. So I've just done up a very basic, I think, tornado chart, but what I think is really cool is this automatically changes based on what option you're selected. So I've actually linked the calculation.
Very cool. There. Love tornado charts. That looks fantastic.
So what I've done is kind of manually made the sensitivity. So I've told it what scenarios line up to each of those sensitivities, and then linked it to their reference project. But this is all dynamic as well, which I think makes it really powerful that I've changed that there. But what if I go back to my revenue and go, oh, actually, instead of $1, it should be $2 instead of $1.12. If you go back to the outputs page, all that automatically changes. You don't have to recalculate anything. And what I find really good in my role in my job is it's nice having the confidence that if I change a number somewhere in the model, I know all these tables are automatically updated. I don't have to remember to press anything to run update, because it's the worst feeling in the world when you've updated an assumption, you've then copied the outputs into your report, hit send to the client and go, oh, I didn't rerun my scenarios. All my sensitivities are wrong. Got to redo it. Don't have to worry about it in here.
Or if you're in a presentation and the client asks, oh, what would happen if I changed the pricing? Or what would happen if we did that?
Very quick and easy to do it now.
You can just change it and it'll just flow through.
Yep, instantly changes. The other thing here, this just uses the scenario number. So should probably take a step back and actually explain what this is doing. So what this is actually, both the tornado chart and this comparison table, which is just comparing the NPVs, what it does is using the scenario number. So this is a drop-down list of all the different projects in there, all the different scenarios, sorry, I've set up. What it does is it uses a sum if to find, okay, what's that scenario's number up the top, and then uses a sum if to actually look up against the data table, the values. So it basically goes across and says, okay, I'm looking for project 1, 2, 3, using sum ifs, basic sum if methodology. It picks up the NPV of that, all which has been calculated dynamically in here. You can also use it to show different charts here. So this is worst case, best case, worst case option for option 2. But if I change this one up here, which it's option 2, that's now option 2 worst case and option 2 best case. So by using some ifs and some references back to the scenario numbers, you can really get some dynamic outputs really quickly out of this modeling approach.
Yeah, that's one of the big frustrations, isn't it? When you do, I normally just go with a really simple best case, worst case drop down. but then of course you can't, it's very difficult to look at them side by side. So you have to either run a macro or, you know, run some data tables or something like that too. And it's great to be able to see them immediately side by side.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's where we use a lot of it. So I think that's probably the main bits I wanted to show.
Right. Well,
as you said, I feel like it's a fairly simple
yeah.
tool.
So that was sort of the overview. So we'll sorry, what did you say? I just missed.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, like, I agree. I think it's a fairly simple tool. Like you were saying, that it's not. I try to keep it as remove any complexity and make it as easy to use as possible.
Well, I mean, it's. I think by making it available for people, they'll be able to sort of trace back and learn. I think you can learn a lot from this model. Firstly, I mean, what strikes me first of all, of course, is just the cleanness and the neatness of it. And I think, you know, just putting the time to make it look so makes it very easy to follow. And then you can also learn a lot about how the scenarios all hang together. I think is going to be really useful for people to be able to reuse it. There's just a couple of questions. Is that okay if I jump into some questions?
Yeah, no problem. Let's have a quick drink.
So just a question from Erin. Is there a way to find the break-even point? Say, for example, what price would we set if we wanted to achieve a certain revenue? So you'd have to sort of run down the data table to do that, wouldn't you? Or run a goal seek to work backwards. Have you sort of got a break-even?
I haven't got one in this example. I have done it though before. So the great thing about it is goal seek has no problem with data tables. So for example, if we wanted to say, so if we say, well, what is the change in, let's do one live as a good example. So let's say, what do I need to increase my revenues by to break even? So as a very quick and dirty, I'm going to say, that equals my NPV, right? So that is that. So all I'm going to do is go home, data, goal seek. I want this cell set to 0 by changing this cell. And there we go. So fairly quick. So a little bit more of a manual process. So obviously if you change any assumptions before it, so if I change my revenue pricing, you'd have to rerun this, but it's not a hard process to do. And I think you could build in checks to make sure that it is done. If like you could have a few checksums along here that, yes, this all equals 0 because of my rerunning as an example. So certainly possible.
And also one from Henry. What do you, in your opinion, is the benefit of using the sum if over the lookup or the index match? I think it's really just a matter of choice in this case, isn't it?
I'm always, if I could get on a soapbox here for a moment, if I could kill VLOOKUP, I would very, very happy to. Lookup itself with no V or H in front, I have no problem with. I think it's quite useful. I use it in this formula mostly because sometimes it's text and sometimes it's numbers. So I find it better to have a consistent, this formula is consistent all the way down. So I don't have to worry about what type of data I'm putting into it. If I know for sure I'm using numbers.
Have you been using the XLOOKUP yet?
Unfortunately, I don't have that on my copy of Excel. I can't wait to get that. Okay. That does look absolutely revolutionary, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. But at the moment, I'm a big fan of SUMIFs with the S at the end. Don't like the original SUMIF. Another one, if I could kill, I would. I just like SUMIFs because it's so much more expandable, even if you're only using a single criteria.
Colin says XLOOKUP will kill the VLOOKUP and the HLOOKUP and the index match. So
perfect.
I think they're still good. I think the other formulas have still certainly got their place.
Very, very happy to update this with a version 2 once I get my hands on XLOOKUP.
Yeah, Mark, we just got another question from Mark. He says it's a great model. What are in the other sheets that have not been shown yet? For example, the profile in sheet. What's on that one?
There's always someone who's curious and wants to see what else is there. First one is just a separation page I added in to make it a little bit cleaner. So this is just the example page. The only other page I haven't shown you is my definitions page. So this is where I include this page on all the models I build. This is actually a fairly simplified version of it, but it's just common things that I use in all my modeling, and some things I don't even.
And we can learn a lot from that as well. A lot of people don't do that, sort of have it about the model and, you know, all the details, but some assumptions.
Rounding, some period stuff. So there's usually a timings page as well. It's connected to it.
I really like, can you just show that?
Sorry, which way?
Just down below the selection where there's a drop down, see where it says dollars. That's really cool. I like that bit.
So what this does is, I don't use it all the time, but I do sometimes, is all my inputs are usually always in dollars, but you can actually set up your output page to be dynamically units. So you could actually have a drop down on here that, okay, I want to look at my P&L in dollars, thousands, or millions, link it back to the definition, to the definitions page, and basically all your outputs, if you divide by this divide portion, when it's in dollars, it's just divide by 1, but otherwise it's divide by 1,000, divide by 1,000,000, just to get that extra, depending.
Yeah, that is such a huge time saver.
Yeah, it's a big time saver for me through the years, as well as these labels. And there's probably some bits I don't always use, but even simple things like yes, no, I find it a bit odd that Excel doesn't recognize yes as 1 and no as 0 natively. Like if you just typed it into a formula, like it's such a common thing. So I basically just set it up so yes and no actually are defined, named right. Just because I use it, I think it's easier to read formulas when reviewing it. If it's something, if this equals yes, great, do it. So sometimes, not always.
Yeah. Francis asks, is there a way that you can see all the options side by side, or do you have to do it manually? No, it's all, you can see everything side by side on the output page.
Yeah.
And Erin just asks, why are these definitions numbered in column Q? What do you the numbers for?
So this goes back to my lookup elements. So these ones don't particularly need numbers, but other ones on my definitions page, you'll see that I have this, what I call model specific definitions. So my profiles, for example, I've defined them as high, medium, low here. This is all linked back to my definitions page. What this options numbering here allows me to run my lookups off it. One of the problems with lookup formula is that if you don't put your inputs in a sequential order, Excel can get confused and return the wrong value. So the simplest way of doing that is just to have integers down the side, and you use that as your driver for your lookups. So for example, if I'm trying to find 2 here, so if I'm trying to return medium here, I'll just do a lookup. My value is here, which may be driven off a sum if or something off my lookup range, which I usually have as a name, profiles there. So just a little bit of a cheat, or not a cheat, but a convention that I've gotten myself into a habit of always putting a number over in this column on the definitions page in particular, because you never know when you need to use, basically I want every one of my lists to have a matching set of integers so I can use it on looking up.
Cool. Rajiv asks, have you built this model in a way to capture the actuals automatically, for example, as the time passes by and you're in 2021, or do you use it for quarterly forecasting? I don't think this model is, you certainly could do that. I don't think this model does that specifically, but you could certainly build that in.
You could build that in onto this calculations page, but yeah, like I said, this is just meant to be a generic financial model with a few different.
Yeah, it's a demonstration.
Yeah.
Of the technique. There's certainly a lot. You could certainly take it a lot further, and I think your hope is that people will apply these sort of methodologies to the existing model. The idea is that you can look at this model and learn from the structure of it, and then apply that to your own models and really build on your own work. I mean, you mentioned earlier when we were talking, Thomas, how much you'd learnt from other people.
Yeah. I came to financial modeling in a bit of a roundabout way. I didn't do a lot of it at university or through other formal courses. It was more of a hands-on, here's Excel, we needed to produce some numbers. I enjoy solving puzzles and problem solving and coming up with the numbers. So a lot of it, I know it gets derided sometimes in social media and the like, but there is a certain element of being a financial modeler, of being skilled at using Google to figure out the problems. But I think it's an element of Excel's been around for so long and so many people use it that there has to be someone else out there that's had a similar problem to you. So what I quite like doing is looking at what other people have done in the past and trying to combine it in new and interesting ways, which is where I think like the scenario, the manager itself came in, that I'm certainly not the first person to use the data table for scenario management, but I wanted to find a new way of doing it. Again, a scenario inputs tab like this above, I don't think is super innovative in itself. What I think is cool here is combining a data table with it, if that makes sense. So I'm very much of the view that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to financial modeling. We all do better when we share. And it's one of the things I love the most about financial modeling is there's almost we all just love sharing and love Excel so much that we just want to share. We want to get the information out there. It's not a matter of wanting to say, oh, this is my cool thing. It's no, it's just a cool thing I figured out how to do and what's something else.
And we all learn off each other. When I first started, there wasn't very much on Google, and I learned from other people, like taking apart their models, and quite often I never even met them. And it was, you just learn from the way other people do things, and then it becomes part of your repertoire, and you can sort of pull it out and you think, oh yeah, this is a situation when I need to use a data table, or that cool thing I saw. And it just becomes, it helps to build your skills the more models you see and take apart.
Definitely, completely agree.
Yeah. So I just if there's no other questions, I just want to ask about those add-ins you've got up there. Pretty cool. I love looking at other people's Excel. It's always interesting to see what add-ins they've got.
So I suppose.
Wow.
So I've got a few in here. So I always have my chat box. There we go. Certainly always have the developer tab open. Admittedly, I don't use a VBA anywhere near as much as I used to. Probably a good habit to get out of anyway. It can sometimes like make you cheat when you don't have to, if that makes sense. My next tab this is a personal add-in I've been developing now longer than I care to admit, of common tools or things that I have had to use over time. So first two are unlock sheets using a common password. So it just cycles through a model and locks everything. Really useful if you need to send it out, but you don't want someone breaking something by accident. Grouping functions are your standard grouping, but it's something I use a lot of. When I've got long calculations, I like to group them to hide so I can scroll through a page a lot easier. Calculation timers is one. There's some VBA code that a colleague of mine and myself adapted from online to actually come up with calculations on there. If he's watching this presentation now, he's probably going, "Oh, you stole that from me." But
we don't steal from each other.
Yeah, no, we don't steal. We just borrow.
Cool.
I really like that, so I put that in.
Don't give it back after.
There's a few other ones in there. Probably the most infamous, notorious is this break password one. That's the old school 2013, 2010 brute force way of breaking a password. Doesn't really work that much anymore, but I've kept it almost there as a bit of a legacy reminder. But the one I think I'm personally most proud of is this one here, these precedents. It really irks me, and I don't know why they do this. I have to find it. That trace dependence, trace precedence then, is a very cool tool, but you can't select if you select multiple ones, it just does the first cell, which is just to me is very unhelpful. So what I've done is I actually developed a little thing in a very simple bit of VBA code to just cycle through all the cells in a selection and run trace dependence or trace precedence. Really, I found that really useful when you're auditing a model or reviewing a model to just go, right, what is this actually being used for? There's been, I'm sure we've all come across cases where we've had this model sent to us, huge block of calculations, you review it only to discover, oh, it's legacy or it's not being used, or a large portion of it's not being referred to, or trying to figure out what's referring to it. Or worse, halfway through a calculation block, the references change and it's harder to spot. This tool has saved me many times on that front. Very basic VBA code in there behind it, but
did you build that, or is that
something? No, I built that, but I think it's 10 lines of VBA code at most.
Oh,
it's just select for each cell. I think it's.
And the same, Nelson's asking about the lock and unlock. Is that also with VBA? Did you create that yourself?
Yep, but that's just lock sheet, look at all the worksheets in a range and lock each sheet, and then return to what cell you're at. So again, fairly simple VBA, but something, it's what I feel VBA should be used for, is that process automation. Instead of having to click a button every time, it just does the same thing repetitively many times.
Cool.
That's my main help. And there's some review tools and some spreadsheet detective linked ones.
So every time you reinstall your Excel, you have to set all this up all over again.
I do, but I've managed to set it up as build it into its own Excel add-in, my own custom add-in.
Cool.
So I don't have to set it up the ribbon each time. I just load in.
It's in there.
It's in there. So I actually built my own add-in, which is probably the most nerdy thing I've had in my life.
Set that up like that. Wow.
So I've been working on that for a little while. Other tools I use, Spreadsheet Detective being the old faithful for reviewing models. Zebra BI, which you can see is locked out because I haven't renewed it for my review tool, but I'll give a shout out to them anyway. It's a very cool data presentation tool. I think it's natively in Power BI, but they've got an Excel add-in which does similar things to their Power BI version, which is very cool. Stuff that Microsoft should buy them and build it into Excel would be my thinking. And then Accelerators, which has some more of that data tracing aspects, being able to cycle through. Another paid add-in, which I think it's worth its weight in gold. Similar to other previous ones, but really useful for being able to, particularly if you go to a output like here and go, how is this being calculated? You can actually click all the way through and work your way through back. So yeah, those are probably my main add-ins. The rest are
sort of like the error. Yeah.
So free shout outs to them.
Chaleshi wants to know if the lock all sheets add-ins only locks the formula and the formatting, and how flexible is a locked spreadsheet? So
I've got it set up that, so probably the bit of the modeling I hadn't shown anyone here is I use extensive amounts of custom styles, which has taken me a while to set up for many years. But what I do is basically I assume my calcs, my hard coded are, if I go into them, modify, they are locked by default. So protection is locked. So if I lock my model, everything, my calc, which is my default cell type, will lock itself. But what I've done for input cells is disable the protection. So
yeah, I would think it's worth spending the time setting up your styles.
Oh, definitely. It saves so much time. And because I know that, okay, my zeros will look like that because that's how I like my zeros. If my
me too.
will have commas in it, or I don't think this version has it in it, but I've set up a style recently which for millions will put an M on the end of it, because we often do reports which need an M at the end. So yeah, cell styles if you take nothing else away from it, 100% recommend doing something similar for yourself, and setting up a blank template with your self styles in there. One I quite like using, which I'm not sure not everyone necessarily does, is this blank unused. It's where I'm trying to highlight to someone, this is intentionally blank, like we all used to see on the end of our exam papers, or things like that, where someone has purposely left this blank. It's not just a blank page for the sake of a blank page. In mine, this is a blank cell, but I want it to be a blank cell.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really neat, and well, it's
yeah, it helps with the structure.
Yeah, it helps your eyes because you've removed the grid lines.
That's
and
right.
It kind of helps your eyes to sort of read it properly.
Yep.
Okay, I think that's probably all we've got time for, unless there was anything else that you wanted to mention, Thomas.
Probably the only thing I'd like to mention is I hope people find some use in this tool, and please reach out if you have any questions or comments, and please do pass on the sharing. If you come up with something cool, find a way of getting it out there.
Exactly.
We'll all learn from it. I still Google problems and want to to find something new, so I'm all about the collaboration and sharing, particularly when it comes to Excel, but in most aspects as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we've a nice comment there from Gerald, who says, of all the webinars I've attended, this one ranks near the top. Thank you for sharing. So thank you so much for being so generous. I'm going to send an email out probably tomorrow with the recording and a file again, and anything else. So look out for that one. So thank you so much, Thomas. That was fantastic. Thanks, everybody. And I'll send your a link to your LinkedIn profile, Thomas, so people can contact you directly if that's okay. All right, and I'll see you next week. We have got a session from Natalie Bayfield on real estate financial modelling, so I'm very much looking forward to that one. So I am going to sign off now, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you, Thomas. Bye-bye.
Thank you.